It's important to remember in psychology that people remember two things more than anything else. The first thing that you said and the last thing that you said. And yes, like the call to action like could maybe be part of that. But for me, the story really ends on that last line. And so that hook and that last line is the most important. So if you want people to walk away with a lesson, then I would reiterate that lesson in that very last line because that's what they're going to take away from it.
Today, I'm very excited to be joined by Michaela Alexis. If you don't know who Michaela is, she is a LinkedIn marketing strategist who trains businesses on leveraging the power of LinkedIn. Her forthcoming book is No Fear Networking, a guide to building connections for the socially anxious professional. And her LinkedIn learning course is called Copywriting for Social Media. Michaela, welcome back to the show. How you doing today?
It's been a while.
I know.
It's been a few years while. I feel like I'm coming out of hibernation. I'm glad to be here.
Well, it's great to see you at Social Media Marketing World this year. And awesome to have you back on the show. So today, Michaela and I are going to explore content strategy on LinkedIn using the written word. Now, Michaela, let's start with this question. Why is the written word so important on LinkedIn?
So I always like to say that LinkedIn is like the world's largest networking event. So everything that you post, whether you like it or not, people are going to make assumptions. People are going to judge you. People are going to kind of look at and try to figure out who you are based on what you post. For a lot of people, you might not ever meet them in person. I know a lot of people on LinkedIn that I've known for years before ever meeting them at a conference. I know lots of people that are just forever digital friends. And so whenever you're posting anything, you're not just conveying information, you're conveying who you are, your identity. And for me, I mean, I'm a little bit biased. I've always had kind of a writer background. I was entering essay writing competitions when I was little. I've always loved written word. But there is something to say about the fact that the written word on LinkedIn has been so unwavering. I've been a content creator on LinkedIn since 2016. And during that time, I've seen lots of different types of content come and go. Rest in peace, LinkedIn stories. I feel like I was the biggest champion of that. But there have been so many different types of content that they've tried, and some have succeeded and some have kind of disappeared. But text has always done really well on LinkedIn. And that's always been hard for me to kind of not want to stray to the different types of formats, but I'm glad that I didn't because it really has withstood the test of time. So I think that overall, I mean, as humans, we're just attracted to stories and storytelling. It's something that has existed forever. And so it's just one of those things that you need to learn this core skill of storytelling in text form.
You know, it's funny because I know so many marketers say to themselves, I need to do more with video. I need to do more with video. I need to do more with video. But the challenge with video is it's linear media, which means you got to sit there and listen to the entire thing, watch the entire thing to get something out of it. What's great about the written word is it's nonlinear, meaning you can skim it. You can decide if you want to spend the time to watch the entire thing after skimming through it, or you can skip through the important parts. And I think in this age we're in right now where people have less attention to give to the social platforms, the written word can kind of draw someone in a way that you just simply cannot do with video. Because some people are just not going to unmute those videos, right? And with the written word, you can just draw people right in. And then, as you mentioned with story, sometimes with a good story, people lose track of time. They get sucked into it. And before you know it, like, you know this, you probably have you binge watched some amazing video stories or read some amazing stories because they kind of suck you in. And that's what I think is so powerful. So reactions to any of that?
Yeah, when I was at Social Media Marketing World, I talked about this idea of cozy content and how LinkedIn is one of the only platforms where people are really open to the idea of content that they can take and cozy up with like a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. That's why newsletters, that's a relatively new feature, but it feels like it's existed on LinkedIn for such a long time because it's such a natural fit for the platform. PDFs, also another natural fit for the platform because people want to learn. And I think that we kind of associate learning primarily with the written word. So there's like that strong association there. But I agree with everything that you're saying. Again, I'm biased, but I think that it's such a powerful, underused skill because it's maybe not quite as sexy as video or some of the other features. And yet it could be one of the most powerful ones that you could use.
Okay, so not everybody is winning essays when they're in school, or is got a book coming
Yeah,
out, or has written books. In my
sure.
case, and even on writing.
Yeah.
So there is a mindset you got to put yourself into, right? So how
Uh-huh.
ought we reframe our thinking before we
Uh-huh.
begin writing anything on LinkedIn? Because everyone listening probably knows how to write in one way, shape, or form, but maybe they don't know how to write in the way that you would advocate.
Yeah.
So what do we need to be thinking about before we get started?
I think the first thing is to remember that it's a muscle. I think that there are probably some people that kind of just naturally lean more towards writing, enjoy it more. But I think anybody can be a great writer. And it's so funny to me when people say that they aren't good writers because they are sometimes the best like spoken storytellers that I've met. And I'm like, it's the same thing except it's written down. And so that's the first thing to know is that anybody can be a writer. I think perspective is really important when it comes to writing on LinkedIn. I'm a mom, so I'm watching all of like these kids' movies. But this quote like has stuck with me since the beginning of the year. It's like Maui from Moana, and he says something like, "You can't know where you're going until you know where you've been." And so I think it's really important to kind of take stock of your experiences, what you've been through, the challenges that you've had to overcome, any of like those milestones that you've met and then try to figure out what insight you can draw from those experiences. Because I think that this is something that we do naturally. We just don't actually write it down. There are things that happen to us in our career. We lost a job, we have a promotion, all of these things happen. And in our head, we're like, this is what I've learned from it. But we don't actually take the time to like take stock of all of those things that have happened and kind of like write everything down. So I think that's super important. Were you going to
Yeah,
say something?
no. Well,
Okay.
let's also talk about like you don't want to just write about anything on LinkedIn, right?
No.
So one of the things we talked about is imagining what success looked like and also understanding what people find interesting. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that for most people, when it comes to LinkedIn, the immediate goal is how many likes can I get on this? How many people can see my content? And as somebody that has done all sorts of content that's gone wildly viral, reaching millions of people, and other content that has been a lot more niche and has reached hundreds, I can tell you that there isn't really a correlation in terms of your opportunities versus your visibility. So that's something that's important to keep in mind. It's who you're speaking to, right? So one post that I did was geared towards job seekers are not necessarily going to be my ideal clients because I'm speaking more to businesses and a lot more execs and training them on LinkedIn. So even though it was an important story to tell, and there is obviously relationship building that's part of that, it ended up in no opportunities for me. On the flip side of that, I wrote a story about a client that I helped. And that ended up in opportunities, even though it reached far less people. So I think it's really important to sit back and figure out what success looks like for you when it comes to LinkedIn. And it's not just about the numbers. What do you want out of the platform? Is it new opportunities? Do you want to build your influence? Are you trying to expand your network with who? Get really, really specific, not just, oh, I want to grow my network because we can all do that. But who do you want to be part of your network? And what do they care about? I think that we tend to write about the things that we're passionate about, which is important, but it's also important to think about what matters to your ideal audience and not just, oh, they care about productivity or they care about AI. Those are the things that they might be interested in, but what are the core values that they hold near and dear? And how can you speak directly to those core values through storytelling?
Well, and talk to me about like so many writers are just going to be like, here's 5 tips. Why is that not
Yes.
working?
I think that we're used to that. I think that we're in an age where there's just information overload and nobody is out there being like, I wish I could learn more about X, because that information is widely available. I think for a lot of people, it's trying to cut through the overwhelm of not knowing how that information applies to them. And so I think it's really important to try and figure out how to speak directly to people and cut through some of that noise, and also not try to be an expert, but more, again, if we're thinking of LinkedIn as the world's largest networking event, can you imagine, Mike, if you went up to somebody and you were like, here are 5 tips to be more productive during your workday? The person would be like, dude, I'm eating cheese right now. They wouldn't necessarily be receptive to it because they're not in that mode yet. We haven't cracked the ice and we're kind of like going straight for it. And so it really needs to be more of a handshake. So what would that look like if you were in person? And for most people, that makes it a lot easier to come up with ideas of what to talk about, because it's really just, well, what are some of the stories that you share when you go to networking events? Usually those stories work because it resonates with the people that you're speaking to. And if you're trying to speak to the same people on LinkedIn, that's probably a story that you should write down, keep in a journal, put in a notes file on your phone, wherever, just keep it somewhere safe. And when the time comes, write about it on LinkedIn.
Well, you perfectly transitioned into my next question, which is how do we come up with ideas and things to talk about? So you've already mentioned a couple things. And I just want to summarize a couple things that I've heard you say, which is remember, it's a network. And when you network with people, you need to talk about things that are of interest to the people that you're networking with, right?
Right.
And that typically means telling a story, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily just instantly sharing, here's 5 ways to do this, or here's 7 ways to do this. So you've already hinted a little bit about how to come up with ideas, but let's just put ourselves in a position where, okay, the listener agrees that they want to start experimenting with written content on LinkedIn. And they kind of feel like in their head, they know they're an expert in this area, but they don't even know kind of exactly where they should take it. So let's talk about like ideas and topics and like how we can come up with a bunch of them, because honestly, you know this and I know this, the hardest part about writing is figuring out what you're going to write about before you write.
It is. And I mean, yeah, definitely elephant in the room. There are days when you're not feeling it, you're not inspired. I get it. I'm in the middle of a book and I'm like writing 1,000 words for my book and then I don't have anything left. And for those days, because I want to get this part out of the way before we talk about other ideas, you can turn to ChatGPT, and that's why it's so important to start with, what does success look like for you on LinkedIn? Who are you trying to speak to? Because if you go on to ChatGPT and you say something like, my audience is, and you describe your audience, I am, describe your role, and my goal is X. What are some topics that might resonate with them on LinkedIn? And you can play around with that prompt. That's not an exact one. But it will spit out some topics that might be of interest to your audience. So for me, I have, it gave me like fear of failure, fear of rejection, transactional networking, and imposter syndrome. There were a whole bunch of other ones, but my current goal is to write about social anxiety, networking, things like that as I write my book. And so now I have at least some themes to write about. And so if I can write those down, now it's going to be a lot easier on those days where it's not coming to me to sit down and be like, okay, wait, I have something that relates to that fear of rejection. I have something that relates to that fear of failure. So getting that foundation and just kind of getting the blood flowing with ChatGPT is really helpful. I think that definitely staying on top of your industry. You can be really good at what you do, but you also need to be on top of all of the trends and things that are
before
happening.
We go on, I want to talk about ChatGPT a little bit more here, because I want to make sure we fully explore this. So I love the idea of going to ChatGPT and saying, what are some topics that my audience might be interested in? Here's who I am. Here's who my audience is. And here's what I'm trying to get them to this is the outcome that I'm hoping to get. Right. So, so ChatGPT comes up with what do they come up with? Like 5 or 6 ideas, and then you're done, or is there more to it than that?
Well, for me, I write those things down and I sit with that list. And then I go through that every week of like, okay, these are the topics that are going to be interesting for my audience. And I can write multiple stories. I mean, fear of rejection, I get rejected like once a week. So it's perfect, right? I always have stories, and that's where
you were rejected once by me, right?
I was rejected once by you. Exactly. And it turned into a great story.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things to remember too, is that you need to get in the habit of seeking out stories. And I think that we have this idea that in order to be taken seriously as an expert, we can only write about the good things. This has actually come up like in the social media marketing world community this week. Someone was asking about something like this. And it's important to not just share that because it doesn't feel genuine. Imagine if you met somebody in person and they were like, my family is perfect. My marriage is perfect. My job is perfect. My life is perfect. You're like sitting there like, okay, are you robotic? Like, what is going on? So it actually increases your level of trust by sharing the good, the bad, the ugly, all of those things. I always like joke around that when good things happen to me, awesome. When bad things happen to me, also awesome, because it becomes a LinkedIn story. It's almost a better story when it's the failure and you share the lessons that you've learned from it, because in a lot of ways, that's more relatable for somebody, especially as they're trying to like progress in their career, than you being like, I spoke on stage in front of 1,000 people. That might not be quite as relevant to them. So it's really important to really seek out stories. Anytime you have an interesting conversation with a client, anytime you go to an event and you listen to a session and you had like an aha moment, make sure that you're writing down all of these experiences, the good, the bad. You can decide later on whether or not you want to share the bad, but taking stock of all of these things that are going on around you is a really great way to build a bank of content.
For those who hear little sounds in the background, those are Michaela's little dogs. And for those of you that never heard it, I apologize now that I've drawn your attention to it. But there is a story there. She was going to potentially throw those dogs outside into the wilderness, and she was concerned, well, they would never survive, right? So there's a little story that we just made out of our little dogs. So
exactly.
So when you're in these scenarios where these little stories pop into your brain, you mentioned documenting them in like the notes file on your phone. What about journaling daily privately too?
You can journal. I used to have like I always tell people I started off on LinkedIn with a couple hundred followers and a notebook and a pen, and that was it. I think I had a little whiteboard that I upgraded to that I would write quotes on, but I would just literally journal what was going on during my day. And I think that's what people have become attracted to when it comes to like my writing, is that it really feels more like a conversation, like a career blog, than hey, this is how amazing I am at this thing. The way that I approach kind of balancing, here's who I am versus my company page, and because I know that there's going to be people listening being like, okay, but what do I post for my company page if I'm also writing written content for that? My personal profile is like my handshake. So that's me going around just meeting people, grading people. I hope that they come and visit my LinkedIn profile. From there, they can go to my company page, follow it. And my company page is going to be a lot more niche. It's going to be very specific to LinkedIn training. I might throw in some fun stuff here and there, but I like to kind of filter people that way. Of course, you can share content about what you're up to also on your personal profile, but I'm a big believer that people don't care about what you have to offer until they know who you are, right? So you need to grab people's attention by doing the small talk, sharing little things, sharing these little stories that are going to connect you with your audience before you dive into, by the way, this is what I have to offer.
So let's get into the story crafting part of this equation, because not everybody understands how to actually tell a story on LinkedIn. So, let's assume we've come up with a relevant story, but what in the world, how do we actually tell the story? Because, there's a way to do it and there's a way not to do it. Let's talk about how to do it,
So the bad news is that this is the hardest part of writing for LinkedIn. The good news is that once you figure this part out, it becomes so you will actually start to create stories in your head crafted in this formula, I promise. So you want to start, we've already talked about this, but you want to start with why. Who do you want to reach? How do you want them to feel? What is the goal of your post? And once you figure that out, you want to use a formula to kind of organize your thoughts. So you're going to start with a hook, and your hook can be anything. It can be an interesting question, an interesting quote. I lately have been really liking using a cliffhanger, then the story, then the lessons, and then a call to action. So that basically looks like, me starting with the point of the story, the climax of the story, then getting into the what, which is my story, then the so what, which is the lessons that I learned through that process, and then the so what, which is the call to action at the end. So I kind of just sort everything through that process.
Okay, we're going to come back to the cliffhanger concept in a minute, but let's start with
It's the final
the
one.
story, the what part. Like, how when we presumably, like, if it was me, I'd be starting in a Google Doc, and I'd probably like start with the story and figure out what the cliffhanger is going to be later. But how do we compose a story in a way that is going to get someone to keep reading it?
So I think that it's important to make sure that it has the beginning, the middle, the end. Take out anything that's not relevant. Let's use the example of the post that I did where you rejected me, right? So I have it here. I started with, "You rejected me again. I couldn't believe it. This time I was far from giving up." So that's my cliffhanger. And then I go back. So years ago, at the start of my LinkedIn virality, I genuinely thought that I had made it. Right. So it's kind of like at the beginning of that story.
Oh, and real quick, I like what you're doing there. What you're doing there is you're showing a fallacy that you had in your brain, right? Right out of the gate, right? You're kind of hinting that you thought something that maybe wasn't true, right? And that's good. Keep going.
Yep. There's one thing that I always dreamt of doing, speaking on stage at Social Media Marketing World, a publication I had admired since the beginning of my career, right? And then I talk about the first time I was rejected by, so I don't even know if you knew that, but years and years ago, at the beginning of my marketing career, I applied to contribute to the publication.
Yep.
Yeah, the blog. And I was rejected then. I can't remember who rejected me. And I said, I never let it go. So I'm kind of like planting seeds, right, in the story. And then when momentum was on my side, I was invited to speak at VidCon. I knew that I had to meet the moment I spotted him, I approached him with determination, sharing my achievements on LinkedIn and my dream to speak at his event.
Okay, real quick. So explain what you're doing here, like with this part of the story.
I'm setting the stage, right? And I also planted the seeds that this could possibly happen again, right? Because I'm saying in the beginning, that fallacy of like, I thought that I had made it. Well, I probably wouldn't have said, I thought that I made it. And then it's like, I met Mike, the end, right? There's usually some sort of roadblock before I get to that point. And people like those. They like to see the stumbles before you reach the finish line.
Well, and you're also setting the context in which someone can imagine this in the brain, right? Like you're at a conference and you've approached me, right? So they can imagine what something like that might look like, right?
Exactly. I'm trying to get the person into my brain. So I said, as I fantasized about the outfit I'd wear on stage, his response jolted me back to reality. "You're not ready." Was he seriously rejecting me again? I was floored. Right? So now it's kind of like I'm at my lowest. Like, I cannot believe that this is happening again. Like, this is so embarrassing. I dragged myself back to the airport like a wounded puppy, right?
Now let's pause for a second. There's a lot more that happened to the story, and there's a lot more that happens in everyone's story.
Yes.
You are selectively just focusing on the key pieces of it. Yeah. Yes. Explain
because
how
if
you
go back. Yeah. If I go back to the why, what do I want my audience to take away? Well, the lesson I know in this is resilience matters. Like, no is not a no forever. And you just have to keep going, and you have to be receptive to that rejection so that you can ultimately get what you want. So if I have that lesson in mind, then I'm going to cut out, I don't need to talk about what I was wearing that day, what Mike was wearing that day. The fact that I met Phil, like, I don't need to bring in other characters. I just need to focus on the rejection, what happened after the rejection.
And
And
you're
then,
not mentioning that you were on the stage with a couple of other women. You're not mentioning that you were
no,
excited because women were invited to speak at this event where it's
no,
predominantly men. None of that stuff was there because it's not relevant for this story, right?
absolutely not. Yeah. And then I go into the lesson, which here is actually embedded in the story, which you can also do. Staring at his business card, the old me, the one that would have seen this as evidence that the world was too intimidating and rejection too unbearable, would have tossed it away, never to revisit the moment again. I took it as something different. Maybe no actually meant no, meant not right now. Right. So you can do it either way. You can embed the lesson into the story itself and then continue. So I said that I emailed you, you gave me a list of things to do. I did it. Then I became a speaker. Or you can say, these are the lessons that I learned from this thing.
Love it.
So
Love it.
there's two different versions of it. And then at the end, I just go, heart if you can relate to this one. Because for me, in this story, all I wanted to do is just create an emotional connection with my audience. These are people that maybe are socially anxious, maybe have a touch of it, maybe have a lot of it. So the point of it is for them to walk away being like, whoa, Michaela got rejected and she kept trying. And Michaela has social anxiety and she kept going. If
Well,
I
and I think
had,
you might have included the fact that you've spoken at this event now multiple times in there somewhere too.
I
right?
did.
Yeah.
Yeah. At the very end, this year marked my second year speaking at the best marketing conference around. And every time feels even more special because of my journey that made that see that rejection is really just redirection. So really also ending the post on reiterating what the moral of the story is. So that's the other thing too, is to make it really, really crystal clear what the takeaway is.
So what I hope everyone is understanding is the key to a good story is to find a struggle. And if you think about any story that you've ever read that you think is really good, including the best shows you watch on Netflix or whatever, like I'm watching Shogun right now on FX, and it's the story of a struggle. It's a story of overcoming, and these are the kind of stories a lot of people connect with. And along the way, it requires you to be, like you mentioned, Michaela, earlier, a little bit transparent and vulnerable. And there's some people that are like, I would never want to share that story because it's going to make me look like a fool. But it's not a fool. You're not a fool when you show that you've overcome, right?
Right. And I always tell people to make sure that whatever you're sharing, it's processed before you're posting.
Right.
This is something that happened years ago.
You don't want your therapy out there for public, right?
No. And I think that it's also really hard to figure out when you haven't processed an experience. It's hard to share the so what. You can't share the lessons unless you've actually processed that properly. So people will feel that. And that's why you see sometimes on LinkedIn, some people listening might be like, oh my gosh, but I watched my buddy Ed posted on LinkedIn about his divorce and it was really awkward. And generally, when you see those posts that feel like oversharing and kind of make you go, that was too much, it's usually because they posted the story, but they didn't share the lessons. So rather than giving energy to their audience, they're extracting it.
Okay, so let's try an example that's not so complicated. Let's just pick something out of the blue because you're so crafty. So you're so crafty at this kind of stuff. So,
oh gosh. Okay.
So let's say that you are a marketing consultant, right, who specializes in LinkedIn, and let's say a segment of your audience doesn't feel comfortable about writing about their professional accolades on LinkedIn because they feel like it's bragging. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's come up with a story on the fly so people can at least understand this. Like something good has just happened. You just won an award for something and you need to figure out a way to say it that doesn't come across as braggadocious.
This is always a huge challenge for people. That's why people hire people to do their bios and things like that.
Right.
I understand it because, again, it goes back to, if you are just to kind of introduce yourself with your accolades, it's not relatable. However, if you can reframe it and talk about some of the challenges that you've gone through, what it means for you personally. There's lots of different angles here. I could see somebody, for me, if I were to be talking about some of my accolades, I might be mention the fact that my dad was from Trinidad and he was an immigrant and he came in his 30s. And that could be an angle right there to talk about how meaningful it is for you personally. You could talk about it from a mental health perspective, that there were times that you felt like quitting. Maybe you could talk about a mentor that taught you to keep going. You could share your zigzag of a career. A lot of people really love the idea of a zigzag rather than a straight line in your career. You could talk about how you were flipping burgers a year ago.
Yeah, or you could talk, I love this. Or you could even talk about, hey, you were encouraged to apply for this award and you personally don't like awards because you feel like it's only the really big companies that succeed that have got the crazy big budgets.
100%.
But you could talk about how this person who you've been working with for a long time thought you really had the goods and you reluctantly went ahead and submitted your stuff for approval. And then you could talk through the entire story, and then you could talk about how you were a finalist. And then ultimately, to your shock and amazement, you were the winner of the thing. You tell it from that perspective, and all of a sudden nobody's going to say, wow, that's like really, you're bragging, right?
We love stories that are almost about fate. You know what I mean? Where it feels like whatever happened was meant to happen.
Right.
So even when it comes to, we're talking about written content in terms of posts, but when you're writing your bio on LinkedIn, it's the same sort of idea of making sure that you're connecting the dots for people so that they can be like, oh, wow, like they were meant to receive this award. They were meant to get this promotion. They were meant to do something bigger. So for me, that's always kind of just showing the path to where you ended up is going to come across way different than you being like, here's this amazing award that I won. It just doesn't feel the same.
Absolutely. Okay, let's talk about cliffhangers. How do we find the cliffhanger once we've got the story kind of crafted in our brain?
There's a few different ways. I mean, first is just mentally kind of knowing what was that aha moment or what was that breaking point for you. For me, when it comes to a lot of the stories that I can think about, I can remember the time that I cried or the time that I got really angry. What was the most emotional point of your story? Because that's usually what leads to some sort of lesson. The other way, because not everybody is built that way, and I'm sure not everybody's mind works that way, is to plug it into ChatGPT. Again, it's all about using the tools that are available. You can still be a great writer, learn how to do copywriting, but also use these tools to augment what you're already doing. And so if you have a story that you're like, this is really meaningful, I know the lesson that I want to share, but I can't figure out where the peak of the story is, just write out your story as is. Don't worry about it being messy because ChatGPT will not judge you for it. Plug it in and say, where's the cliffhanger? Where is the peak of this story? And then whatever it spits out, then that's what you're going to use for that first line of your story. The reason that that's important, if you go on LinkedIn, you're going to notice that you're going to see the first line or two of somebody's post before they click on see more. So that's the first part. Caveat to that, make sure that it actually relates. You don't want it to be clickbaity because you want somebody to read your story from beginning to end. That's the whole goal. So you don't ever want people to walk away being like, you see on Instagram sometimes it's like the tabloids and it's like rest in peace and it's like someone broke up with their boyfriend or something like that. And the person's like, oh, like they feel duped. You don't want people to feel duped because the goal is obviously to build connections, to build trust. For most people, I would assume that's a goal on LinkedIn. So you want to make sure that the cliffhanger actually does relate to the story.
And just to be crystal clear, to help people understand this, when you watch, sometimes when you listen to podcast episodes, you'll hear like what the money quote is what I call it, right? Where you'll hear a little clip sometimes before the show starts. I don't do this on my show, but I know that we do this on YouTube for our shows where they'll find like the best quote and they'll stick that right at the beginning, which gives kind of a tease of what's coming. Same idea.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And this, in the case of a story, you also think about like, whenever you watch a series where they talk about what happened last time, right?
Yep.
They're showing you the peaks of what happened last time to bring the story back
Yep.
into your brain. But
Mhm.
or sometimes they'll show you the peaks of what's about to happen, right?
Yep.
And in the case of a cliffhanger, really what we're doing is we're giving away the highlight of the story. And then the reason why that works for people is because they want to see what leads up to that story and what happens after that,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So it's not like the cliffhanger is never the moral of the story. It's the
No.
most painful moment in the story. Is that right?
That is right. It's at social media marketing world, I refer to it as, when you watch like a movie or you watch a show and they're like, it's something crazy that happens. And then they're like, it's the narrator that's like voiceover. And they're like, you're probably wondering how I ended up here. It's that, but in written form.
Got it. Okay, cool. So, what about the lesson side of it? Because telling a story,
Yep.
some people are really gifted at telling stories, but either there's a bazillion lessons they could share, or they're not sure what lessons to share. But how can we add that so what component, as you call it, into our stories?
Maybe I'm getting too friendly with ChatGPT on this podcast, but that's another one that you could plug into ChatGPT and say, hey, this is my goal. This is what I want people to walk away with. What are the lessons that I can extract from this story? That's one way to do it. I think that it's really important to make sure that your lessons align with your goal. So it goes back to like, who are you speaking to? Like that is probably the biggest thing is who are you speaking to? I saw a post not long ago. I don't know if you saw this on LinkedIn. It was like a crying CEO and it ended up going super viral. So this CEO was wrote a post on LinkedIn and he was crying in the photo. And then he posted about the story about like how difficult it was for him to lay off an employee or something like that. It went so sideways, even though he had obviously the best intentions. And as a marketer, I was like fascinated with this story because I could see what happened right away. He was a CEO. Well, the majority of people that are on LinkedIn are employees. They don't work for themselves. They work for somebody else. So that's something to keep in mind when you're posting. If you are speaking to employees as a CEO, you're probably not going to get a lot of empathy for having to make those hard decisions. Even though if you were, say, in a room of CEOs, that's a totally different audience and they would completely understand what that anguish felt like. And so, again, it's really important to make sure that those two things align because it could have been something as simple as, a story about how he had to do this thing. But he's helping this employee find a new job. There could have been a whole bunch of different directions that story could have taken, but it was the wrong lesson with the wrong audience. So it was just a total mismatch. So that's one thing to keep in mind.
And a little aside on this, I do a weekly post across all the social platforms. And one of the ones I did most recently was when my coach told me I hate it. That's how I opened it up. My coach told me I hate it. That's how I opened the post. And it was specifically about the art for this new project I'm working on. And I told the whole story. And then one of the lessons I used, there was a bunch of lessons, but one of the lessons was that I used AI to help me come up with a better color palette. And it was like one of 3 lessons right in the middle. And it was really fascinating to see some of the audience thought it was horrible that I used AI to ask, to get feedback specifically on an image and ask for a different color palette. So this is what's going to happen sometimes with your morals. Like some people are going to clue in on one little thing and they're just a minority sometimes and you can't let it get to you, correct?
Right. The other thing that I would say with that is that hate is such a powerful word that it is like, it could go all different directions. It's a volcano, right? So it's a great line.
Yeah.
It's a great line and it's a great hook, but that's something to keep in mind that it could stir up feelings in somebody.
Yeah.
That regardless of what the post was about, they're angry.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yep. Well, and the moral of the story here is that your lessons may not, how do we connect the lessons to the story? Because, for example, with the story that we did, we just talked about with you getting rejected and ultimately being able to speak at Social Media Marketing World, there's a million lessons you could have picked out of it. One lesson could have
Sure.
been that you needed practice. Another lesson could have been that rejection was the motivation for you to try harder. I mean, there's so many things, right?
Humility, like all sorts of lessons.
But how do you know which ones to pick and how many should we include in any post? Because you could use variations of that story over and over again if you
And
wanted
you
to.
and you should. You should. I mean, I have the same stories that I have been sharing for years. And sometimes something happens where I'm like, what? And I'm sure that anybody listening can relate to that. Like, it's like let's say you lost a job, and in the moment it felt hurtful and scary. And then years later, you're like, whoa, that happened because it needed to, because then this happened. So your perspective on things that happen to you are going to shift. So I encourage people to share one lesson. I think that people don't have the tolerance for multiple, also this,
Oh.
also this, also this. So focus
Interesting.
on one core lesson,
Okay.
make it crystal clear, so that people can walk away with that golden nugget, and then keep the rest of them for another rainy day, because you can retell that same story in different ways. And I have had people that have been like, I've heard the story a million times and it never gets tiring, because you always find like new ways to tell it and new lessons to share. But that's life, right? Even if you're telling a story in person, I mean, there's telephone, right? My mom is like the worst for this. It's like one memory, I'm like, Mom, what are you talking about? It's a totally different story than it was 10 years ago. But that's what happens with our mind too. And so the same thing is true for LinkedIn. If you have a great story, retell it a bunch of different ways, find different lessons from it, share it with different audiences and see how it works with different audiences as well.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say is, hey, let's come up with a good story. Let's make sure it's contextually relevant for the audience that we want to attract. Let's make sure there's a good peak of the story that can be our cliffhanger at the beginning of the story. And let's pick one real big lesson that either can be integrated into the story like you did, or can be specifically called out after the story, which is kind of your post reflection on the story. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that it's important to remember in psychology that people remember two things more than anything else: the first thing that you said and the last thing that you said. And yes, like the call to action, like, could maybe be part of that. But for me, the story really ends on that last line. And so that hook and that last line is the most important. So if you want people to walk away with a lesson, then I would reiterate that lesson in that very last line, because that's what they're going to take away from it.
Well, you brought up the hook. So let's talk about ending the post. And are you suggesting we just end the post with the lesson, or do we want people to take a certain action?
No, I think that you should always be inviting conversation. I mean, from the algorithm perspective, the algorithm is looking that you are asking questions and you're inviting conversation. That's what LinkedIn wants, because they want people to stay on the platform. So I think that you should play by those rules for sure. It doesn't need to be complicated here. Really, again, it goes back to what is the goal of your post? Like for me, I might do a story in the next few weeks when my pre-order is available, and my call to action might be go and pre-order your book if this is something that's interesting to you. But for the most part, when I'm doing these kind of like heartfelt stories, these like career blogs, it's really more of like, hurt if you feel me. Have you ever experienced something like this? Tell me about a time that you were rejected. What did it lead to? And keep in mind that depending on what your topic is about, you're going to get different reactions and different levels of reaction. So I noticed that if it's something about like your successes, people are going to be like, oh, let me tell you about this time I was successful. People love to talk about that openly on LinkedIn. Of course, it's the easy stuff. If you are writing about something that is more personal, rejection, failure, mental health, even though that post is still important, you're probably going to get more private messages. You're not going to get so many public comments. So that's something that kind of like I've noticed over the past few years, is that when I am creating my goals for my posts, I have to be careful about with those like posts, especially like the one that I just mentioned about rejection. I know that people aren't going to comment. They might like it more, but I'm not going to get as many comments as I would on something that's more positive. but it's still important because I'm going to get people into my inbox. So if you know that you're writing about something that's more sensitive, having a call to action like send me a message if this is something that you've related to, or if you have a story to share, I'd love to hear it. Send me a private message. That's a really great way to continue building relationships beyond just on your newsfeed. So it goes back to your goals. You want to make it really crystal clear. Don't use multiple calls to action, just like don't use multiple lessons. You want to make it really, really clear what you want the person to do next. So just stick to one. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I think we overcomplicate calls to action a little bit, but it can really be as simple as, and a lot of my calls to action are like, heart this if you needed this week, or heart if you agree with this. That's a low commitment ask. And usually people will share their perspective anyways, but especially for those more heartfelt stories, just keep it really simple.
Michaela, Alexis, I'm assuming LinkedIn is the preferred platform if people want to reach out to you. And if you do reach out to Michaela, let her know you heard about her on this show. And if you want people to connect with you for other opportunities and stuff, do you also want them to go to LinkedIn, or do you want them to go to a specific website, or where do you want them to go?
Yeah, they can go to micalexis.com/SME. I have all my links there, my LinkedIn profile, my LinkedIn page. You can subscribe to my newsletter from there, the LinkedIn Lowdown, and you can learn more strategies, tips, and tricks, and we can just geek out about LinkedIn together. And
can you spell that just also, for the people that are, is it MIC, Alexis?
MICKALEX. I feel like I'm on a spelling bee. MICKALEXIS.com @SME.
Well, wait, not at MICK Alexis.com/SME.
/SME. I don't think that even exists.
Now we're going to have to come up with a story about this. No, Michaela, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.
It was a blast. I was super excited. Thank you for having me.